Yeah.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome. I'm Hunter Ohanian, the director of the Stonewall National Museum and Archive here on a very rainy night here in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. And I want everybody to say hello to our guest this evening, Jeffrey Jackson. Hi, Jeff. How are you?
Hello. Good. How are you?
Good. Where are we finding you this evening?
I'm in Memphis tonight.
Yeah, Memphis, Tennessee. How are things there?
Well, it's been a nice day, beautiful day, actually, although the storms are going to come in tomorrow. But we've enjoyed a nice February day.
Nice, nice. And you've been there, you said, what, 2 decades, 3 decades?
I've been at Rhodes College this is year 22 for me. I started in 2000, so it's easy for me to do the math.
Yes, of course, you're a professor in history, specializing in European history and culture. And so we're very happy to have you here this evening and talking about the book Paper Bullets. And it's such a great provocative title. And so there's a lot for people to learn about in the book. And we'll get to you and the book in just a minute. I want to say a shout out. I want to give a shout out to my colleague, Paula Sierra, who's there. Hi, Paula. Nice to see you.
Oh, nice to see you guys too.
Thank you for helping us out behind the scenes. Paula is in Miami right now. Is it raining in Miami?
Not yet, but it will soon.
These storms come and go. And so, Paula, thank you for all your help.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, so for all of you joining us, thank you. We're happy to have you here. If you have any questions or comments during the talk, just pop them into the chat or the Q&A, and we will certainly monitor those. Want to say hello to our friends on Facebook. We have a lot of people watch these programs on Facebook, and so thank you to all of you for joining us. And if you have somebody who is interested in tonight's talk, they're not able to see it, this will be posted on our website at stonewall-museum.org. Give us about 72 hours and we will have this up on the website. And you can see all the talks that we've done over the last 18 months. I was actually thinking this morning that, we're getting close to coming to up to 2 years of these virtual talks because of COVID. And it's just been wonderful. It's been one of the real silver linings to COVID, in the sense that we've been able to bring so many authors here and talk about books that either they would not be able to travel down here or we would not have the resources to bring them here. And so it's been wonderful to be able to do it. Last week, we had Sarah Schulman on, who was talking about Let the Record Show, about the history of HIV and AIDS and the activism involved around HIV. And then in the beginning of March, we're going to have Alan Eisenweg, who'll be talking about his great new biography about George Platt Lynes. And so I'm very much looking forward to that. And so you can see all these things, the ones that we've done in the past, as well as the future events we have lined up on our website at stonewall-museum.org. It's been really great to bring everybody here. If you are in South Florida, please feel free to stop by at Stonewall. We're located at 1300 East Sunrise, and we're the largest LGBTQ library in the country, with over 28,000 volumes about queer history. And so that's just astonishing. In addition, we have an archive, and the archive has 2,700 linear feet. And to understand what that means, that's all the way up one side of the Empire State Building and all the way down the other. It represents 6 million pages of LGBTQ history. And of course, it's a resource for many academics and researchers and writers who could come in there. We just recently got a grant from the Mellon Foundation, which allows us to digitize. Right now, it looks like over 200,000 pages of the archive, which is really amazing. And so, Paula, I'm thinking about you as we think about all that work that you've been doing to try to make all that stuff happening, because Paula's been doing a great job of making that happening. And that will probably launch sometime in late spring or early summer. And so people should look for that. In the library and museum, we have 2 exhibitions up right now. One is called Misinformation, which is looking at the similarities between the early days of the HIV and AIDS epidemic going back to 1981 and the similarities of misinformation, which is out today with COVID. And it's really remarkable to see how those similarities lie. And then last week, we opened a new show called Robert Gerard. He was a photographer who made over 500 portraits of LGBTQ writers and activists from about 1985 until his death in 2002, so maybe 17 years. And so we have 10 beautiful silver gelatin prints in that exhibition, and they are on loan from the estate. They're absolutely beautiful. So please come by and see that exhibition. You can read about all these things on our website at stonewall-museum.org. And if you don't get our emails, you can sign up there. We only send them out once a week on Tuesdays. We don't ask for money too often, which is a good thing, but we do ask for it occasionally. And I think that's it. Oh, last thing I want to say is I want to say thank you to our friends at Our Fund. Our Fund is a very large community foundation here in South Florida, and they provide support for this program. And so thank you to our friends at Our Fund for making this happen. So I think those are all the notes I have here. And again, remember, if you have questions or comments, pop them into the chat and the Q&A. And let's go back to Jeff. And so Jeff, it's great to see you. As I said, you and I have not met or worked together before, so it's nice to actually work with you. I'm not hearing anything.
Okay, sorry, I muted myself there while you were talking. I forgot to unmute. Thank you so much for that and for inviting me. It's a great honor and pleasure. And like you said, it's the silver lining in COVID has been, being able to participate in a lot of these video presentations and things. And I've been able to travel, so to speak, virtually, really all over the world and do talks about this book and to talk to a lot of different people that I probably could never have been able to do in person. So, so in a funny way, it's actually, been a kind of blessing in disguise, or at least it's opened up a new opportunity. Maybe that's
I think that's.
I appreciate the invitation.
Yeah, and of course, many of us are just over Zoom right now, but the beauty is, of course, it's a great way for us to talk to people. And I do think we will find new ways to use Zoom and to use remote technology. I mean, hey, this is how they did it on Star Trek. And so, and so we should be able to, do it here. So let's talk about paper book bullets. It is something of a intriguing title, and we of course are going to understand why they are paper book bullets and the 2 heroines of the book. But before we get into some of those details, and we're going to get into a presentation as well too about this, but just tell us a little bit about the origins, how this book started, how did you get involved in it, what intrigued you about spending the time in the research that you did? Because obviously you did a fair amount of research. A lot of it, I forget which archive it was, the Jersey Heritage Collection, a lot of them.
Right.
So just give us a little bit of background. Why this topic and why this book?
Sure, and I'll hold up the paperback edition too. It's because it's now back if anybody is interested in seeing that. No, it's an amazing story, and it took me about 7 years to write, not just the Jersey archive, but a number of other archives as well, archive at Yale, archive in London, and some other resources. So everything in the book is true. This is a work of nonfiction. It's all sourced, with documents and things from the archive. As I'll tell here in just a few minutes, it's an amazing story about resistance and about perseverance in the face of grave danger. And I think it's a story that, really has a lot of resonance today. And that's part of, I think, what drew me to it in a lot of ways, is that as I've talked to audiences all over, people say, wow, this story is strangely relevant today. So that's part of the attraction. Really, the thing that brought me to it in the first place, though, is were the images, the photographs, and I'll show some of those photographs in a few minutes. And And folks who might want to look more, you can find more of the photographs on my website, jeffreyhjackson.com. I put some of the images, including some of the well-known images and also some of the lesser-known images that these two women created, because they were both artists, worked together on this collaborative photography. But when I started looking at these photos, really I came to the photos because of my wife. My wife is an art historian, and she taught a course in the history of photography for many years. And one day she said, you should really look at these women, they're really amazing. And so I started looking at the photos, and the photos they're beautiful, they're strange, they're bizarre, they're wonderful, they're exciting, they're provocative, they're all sorts of things. These photos that they made in Paris in the 1920s, 1930s. And so I started looking at those images and then trying to find out more about them and their story. And as I did, I realized that, a little bit had been written here and there, but not as much as not the full story. It didn't seem to me. So I started to investigate. And once I started, getting into it, I had to keep going because it was so interesting and provocative.
Yeah, I think that's so interesting how it evolved. And as I was mentioning in our pre-show conversation, I had used some of Claude Cahun's images in exhibitions at the Leslie Lohman Museum of Gay and Lesbian Art in New York. So I was definitely familiar with her work, but I knew nothing about the story. And I agree with you 100%. I think the idea that the story is really incredibly relevant today, in the idea that there can be resistance, and it's not, I can't quite call it passive resistance. At least it's not violent resistance. And you're going to get into the details. But the other thing I want everyone to think about too is that when these two women were alive and working in the early part of the 20th century, there was a whole coterie of artists and queer people. I mean, I really do think about, the portraits of Bernice Abbott at the time and all of her friends. And so we have to sort of bring ourselves back to that period in France, and in France particularly, but in Europe and certainly in Germany, where sexual orientation and gender fluidity and those terms that we think of today, that those terms weren't words that they used at the time, but it was a lifestyle which was very similar to what people see today. And again, when these two women were coming of age, when they were in their 20s, I'll have to go back and double check, but the word homosexual wasn't even discovered until like 1860 or 1870, and then the word heterosexual came after it. But people, those labels weren't even there for individuals. Same-sex love or same-sex attraction was just something that individuals did at the time. And so they were pioneers, and they were part of a community that accepted them. And again, I think in many ways it's comparable to what some people are finding out today. And so thank you for actually taking your professional background and sort of diving into this part of the queer community, because as I say, this is, well, in this case, it's not American history, but so much of gay history is American history, but this is human history is what you're talking about.
I think that's right. And I think, for all the reasons that you were just saying, about how we use labels and how we identify, and those things evolve, those things have a history, and it's part of the human story. And it's a part of the human story that's often untold. It's something we don't want to talk about for various reasons or haven't wanted to talk about. But I think as more people bring those stories to the fore, really getting down to ground level, to the lived experience, that's what I always tell my students. Let's think about the lived experience of people at this moment. Then that's where I think you find these kind of amazing stories. So, and of course, then also set during the war, their resistance is not only in terms of gender, in terms of sexuality, but their resistance is also very political. And of course, those things are connected then as they are now, but connected, within a very specific context of wartime danger. And that's part of what makes their story all the more amazing, is that they really did risk their lives.
Yeah, and it really is that otherness that that certain people evolve to, and also I think your point is dead on when we think about what's happening here in Florida right now, that we actually have a movement by the state legislature and our governor to actually outlaw the use of the word gay or sexual orientation in public schools. So what that actually means, that if you and I were talking about this book in a 6th grade, if this bill passes, if this law passes, we would not be able to speak about it as honestly as we're talking about it right now. That what we're saying right now would be prohibited speech because of the fact it deals with somebody's sexual orientation or gender identity. And with these individuals, gender identity was as big of an issue for them, at least from my reading of your book, as their sexual orientation was.
I think that's right. I think, and they were grappling with what that meant, of course, at a time when they didn't have, the language for doing that. And they were very honest to think about it, about not really knowing what to do. And I talk about in the book that part of what they have to do is to navigate, in the same way that people find themselves now because of laws like the one you're talking about, having to navigate these conversations and navigate, different context, different moment, but some of the same kinds of pressures pushing people back and forth. And I think that's why, the work that you're doing at the Stonewall Museum and other groups around the country is so important right now, because with laws like that, or movements to try to outlaw that kind of speech or to kind of regulate, it makes it all the more important to have organizations like Stonewall Museum and other groups that are continuing to tell those stories, so that if folks may not be able to access it in a school classroom, they can come to your museum, or they can read my book, or they can find it on the web, or they can do other things. And that's such an important work that people are doing, I think.
Yeah, and I mean, what we can do right now at Stonewall is that, we're trying to push out as many resources that we have about telling these stories out to people. And because we want parents, we want students, we want teachers who are sympathetic to this point of view, for them to know that if the government were to crack down on making these stories available, that there are individuals who say, so what, we're going to help you find those stories. Not that we're advocating a particular point of view, it's just simply we're trying to put facts out there. And of course, you as a historian, you obviously appreciate the importance of facts in all of this.
Definitely.
Yeah. So I know you have a presentation here, and so maybe we can take a moment and share your screen. And I hope I didn't say too much there in the opening, but I think what we should do is really kind of give you an opportunity, Jeff, to sort of talk through the book and the story, because I think it's really an interesting one.
Well, thanks. And I can you see the screen share? Is that working?
It's great.
Okay. Well, I will sort of talk my way through the book. And this is a kind of a scripted presentation that goes with the images on the screen. But we may sort of pause and have some additional conversation, I think, as we go along. I'll probably read a couple of excerpts from the book as well, that I've sort of lightly edited just for clarity here in this context. But what I want to try to do is to kind of give the sort of overview in a sense, but also touch on some of the issues that you just raised. And my clicker is not working. There we go. So I want to start really by just sort of introducing you to these two women that we've been talking a little bit about already. And if you know something about the history of art, and especially the history of photography, you may have heard of them before. But even if you do know their work, you may not know much about the story of how and why they fought the Nazis for 4 years. Now, their story has really inspired a lot of people, including me, and I'm really glad to be able to share it with you. So please meet Lucy Schwob and Suzanne Malherbe, two of the most unlikely Nazi fighters that most of you probably have not heard of. They were Parisian artists. Lucy was a writer and Suzanne was an illustrator who had studied in art school when she was young. Together, the two of them collaborated on what people in their own day saw as some sometimes shocking photographs. They were friends with and influenced by many of the great modern artists in Paris of their day: Picasso, André Breton, Salvador Dali, Jean Cocteau, and many others. but their images turned ideas of gender and identity on their heads. More than anything, that's really what they're known for today. And if you do know them, you know them by some different names. And the issue of names is something that I'll talk about here in just a minute, because it's very important for them. But after they left Paris and they left the art world behind, they put their skills as artists to work fighting against the German army on the island of Jersey, which is one of the British Channel Islands just off the French coast. They used their creative powers to get inside the heads of the soldiers. Now, in brief, here's how it worked. Luc and Suzanne created a PSYOPS campaign, a psychological operations campaign, designed to demoralize the soldiers, telling them that the war was a lost cause and trying to convince them to go home to their families. And they did it in a very unexpected way, with notes like the one you see here on your screen, or summaries of BBC News reports. They created drawings and songs and bawdy jokes and provocative slogans, many of them typed on little slips of paper. And they left them around the island for the Germans to find. And in some cases, they even put those notes directly into the pockets of the soldiers themselves.
So Jeff, yeah. let me stop there. So for those of you who are students of history during World War II and in the Pacific Theater, we know about Tokyo Rose and how Tokyo Rose was a Japanese operative who there would be messages that Tokyo Rose would put out there to try to tell you, and she would speak in English over radio, and she would try to convince the American soldiers and the Allied soldiers who were in the war that it was a lost cause. So was this kind of the same idea about bringing out or bringing to soldiers, trying to understand the weaknesses that they might have believed about the cause that they were fighting for, to get them to maybe not fight so hard or put their weapons down?
In some ways, I think that's right. And there's a lot of that kind of thing that goes on in various venues of the war. The Germans are doing the same thing. They're broadcasting to the British in English. I think what's different about this is, I'll say here in a few minutes in the presentation, is that I think that it's the way they go about it, and it's the particular sort of identity that they take on in order to do it. I think it's a combination of sort of their technique, their method, and also their approach. I think there's a kind of intimacy to this that you don't see in radio broadcasts, but rather, the fact that they were putting these notes in German soldiers' pockets or leaving them around the island for soldiers to find. And so I think that's something also that's very different. So there's certainly some parallels, and in fact, the name Paper Bullets comes from, I don't talk about this in the presentation, but I talk about this in the book, from a phrase that's from the Allies themselves. The Allied Psychological Operations Initiative uses that term paper bullets to describe what they're doing with dropping Allied leaflets behind enemy lines. So the Allies are doing, the military is doing the same thing. But this is a kind of homegrown campaign that Luc and Suzanne come up with on their own. Well, let me, I'm a little bit concerned about time, and so I may skip ahead a little bit so that we can make sure that I get to everything. So I think I'll skip the first excerpt and get to this question, because one of the things that I think is important to think about, and something that I had to sort of grapple with, was the question about their background. Why would two women with so much to lose put their lives on the line in the way that they did? And what was it about who they were that gave them the strength and the power to become resistors? Because after all, most people did not become resistors during World War II. Can you see the slide okay?
Not yet.
Not yet. Okay, sorry. Let me go back to. There we go.
There we go. Yep.
To the wrong screen. Yep. So thinking about their background and who they were. So let me tell you a little bit about their backgrounds. I think it's important to the story. Lucy and Suzanne grew up around the turn of the 20th century in the southern French city of Nantes as daughters of wealth and privilege. Lucy's father was a newspaper owner and editor, and Suzanne's was the head of the medical school and a well-known physician. So they were never really starving artists, even when they moved to Paris as young women in their 20s, just after World War I, to pursue their artistic careers, because they always had family resources. One reason they didn't really become famous even in their own day, even in the art world, is that they never really needed to publicize their work in order to make money. But they were, of course, known in certain circles, such as among the surrealists with whom they were friends. But for decades, they were largely forgotten until they were rediscovered essentially in the 1980s. But to become resistors, they would need to give up the privileges and the comfort of the wealth that they were born with. But why would they? That was a question I really had to sort of grapple with. I think there were some key things about their life stories, which, although they didn't know it at the time, would set the stage for their resistance against the Nazis. First of all, Lucy's father's family was Jewish. Although he was assimilated and didn't practice the faith, Lucy embraced elements of her Jewish identity that were taught to her by her grandmother. There were also several rabbis and scholars of Jewish life in the family. Lucy was 4 years old at the height of one of the worst anti-Semitic episodes in modern French history, the Dreyfus Affair. Now, that's a complicated story, but it led to crowds outside the family's apartment shouting down with the Jews. Now, later, when Lucy was 12, she was attacked by other children in school who pelted her with rocks and anti-Semitic taunts while she lay helpless on the ground. So Lucy and Suzanne would both of them would remember these horrible days, and the memory would fuel their hatred of fascism and their willingness to fight it. But a second factor that allowed them to become resistors was the fact that they were in love. Lucy and Suzanne had met as young girls in the elite circles of Nantes society, and they had played together from childhood. And by the time they were teenagers, they began a relationship that was in tension with a conservative French Catholic society that valued respectability. Most people in France at the turn of the 20th century did not see a lesbian couple as respectable. Their connection was made even more complicated by the fact that in 1917, Lucy's divorced father married Suzanne's widowed mother, making the girls stepsisters. But their feelings were powerful. And Lucy wrote in a thinly veiled article published in a Nantes-based literary journal that her feelings for Suzanne were her idée maîtresse, her main idea, her guiding principle. She wrote, "I am in her, and she is in me, and I will follow her always, never losing sight of her." And this illustration, I think, is a really powerful way of demonstrating that. It's a drawing that Lucy did. And you see at the top the three letters LSM, it's their initials, LS, Lucy Schwob, and Suzanne Malherbe, SM, but they're combined together. And when you phonetically pronounce those three letters in French, you get LSM, which means they love each other.
Just to pause for a second here, going back to that last slide, who wouldn't want to be in a relationship where one partner said about the other, "I am in them, they are in me," you know, regardless of one's orientation or race or gender or anything else? These are such powerful words that everybody would aspire to.
Right, I think that's right. And I think it becomes really crucial to the way that the story plays out. Because when they end up drawing on their own experiences, what ends up happening is that Lucy and Suzanne were exploring these questions about gender and sexuality as fluid and changing categories, as we were talking about earlier. And that's actually one of the things that they're most famous for. In fact, they're not known in the art world by these names that you see on the screen, Lucy and Suzanne, but rather they're known by their artistic names, Claude Cahun and Marcel Moore. Now, they assume these names to create new identities and also to cross gender lines. Claude, in particular, is a name that's used by both men and women in French. And Cahun put it this way in a memoir that she published in 1930. She wrote, "Masculine, feminine, it depends on the situation. Neuter is the only gender that always suits me. If it existed in our language, no one would be able to see my thoughts' vacillation." So for her, gender was situational, it was conditional, it was fluid depending on the moment. But this name that she chose, Claude Cahun, also allowed her to express her Jewishness. It was just as much in some ways about Jewishness as it was about gender, because Cahun was the name of one of Lucy's set of grandparents. And it's especially the grandmother who taught her about her Jewish heritage. Cahun is also the French version of Cohen, which is the Hebrew for priest. So it's this combination of gender and Jewishness that she embraces in that name.
So let's stop here for a second. So here we see this amazing double exposure of a self-portrait. Which do you happen to have the year that this piece was made?
I don't have the year of this specific one. I want to say it's probably around 1925, 26.
So this is groundbreaking work that they were making at this time.
Absolutely, and I think it speaks to so many things that they were trying to do in this work, both at the personal level and also at the artistic level. These identities and the images that come out of those identities are really allowing them to create this new sense of self, these new identities that were designed to slip the trap of traditional bourgeois society. And yet they only ever called each other Lucy and Suzanne. They only used the names Claude Cahun and Marcel Moore when they were doing their artistic work. Now we tend to call them Cahun and Moore today because we're familiar with them really only through their art. But in private, and with one another and in their writings, and I found this over and over again in the documents that I was looking at in the archives, they referred to each other by their birth names, Lucy and Suzanne. So if you've seen this work, and I'll show a few other images here, if you've seen the work under these names of Claude Cahun and Marcel Moore, you know the ways in which their photographs depict Cahun in gender ambiguous dress or pose, playing with these notions about masculinity and femininity, in some ways helping to invent the idea of what we would now call queerness long before our current understanding of that idea was created. And in fact, a lot of queer and transgender folks today see them as early heroes and role models. Their photos really sort of deconstructed gender categories, showing them to be masquerade and performance long before scholars would ever take up those questions. And Cahun puts it this way very explicitly in her autobiography. She says, "I shave my head, wrench out my teeth, my breasts, anything that is embarrassing or annoying to look at, stomach, ovaries, the brain, conscious and covered in cysts," really suggesting that gender and sexual identity was altering gender and sexual identity is part of the goal. And really this idea of creating a new self. And I always like to show this photo comparing Cahun and David Bowie, both folks who were known for questions about gender fluidity. And Bowie also commented on some of their work that he saw much later in a 2007 show. He wrote on his blog, "I find this work really quite mad in the nicest way." But this whole question about crossing gender lines is really essential. And I'm going to come back to that in just a second, because that's important to how they go about this work, how they go about the process of fighting against the Nazis. So here we have an image of the island of Jersey, where they moved in 1937. They left Paris behind. By this point, they were both in their late 40s. They had vacationed on the island of Jersey many times over the years, so its beaches and its natural beauty were very familiar to them. And it was also a perfect respite for them because Lucy had a number of chronic health issues, a number of medical issues that Suzanne always helped to nurse her through over the years. And Paris had become very deeply politically polarized by the 1930s. Groups were literally fighting in the streets, fascist groups, proto-fascist groups, and of course with fascism on the rise all across Europe, Jersey really seemed like it would be a peaceful escape. So you can see more of their images, sort of just beautiful pastoral images. Jersey is a beautiful place. I spent some time there, of course, doing the research, and I can totally understand why they would want to live there.
And just to remind everybody, of course, isn't Jersey one of the islands in the English Channel?
That's right. It's one of the Channel Islands. There's 7 inhabited Channel Islands just off the French coast.
Are they French or British?
Much closer to France. Sorry.
Are the islands French or British?
They're British, but they're physically much closer to France, but they're actually they're loyal to the British Crown. They're quasi-independent. I mean, they have their own elected government, but they're loyal to the British Crown and they're protected by the British military. They use British currency and so forth, but they also have their own independent tax laws and other kinds of things. Jersey is actually a very famous tax haven. One Cayman Islands, it's one of the famous tax havens in part because of this kind of quasi-independent status that they have. When they moved to Jersey also, they basically stopped using the names Claude Cahun and Marcel Moore and really only used the names Lucy and Suzanne, except when they were maybe corresponding with friends back in Paris. But little did they know when they got to Jersey that they were stepping into what would soon become a war zone. And when the fighting broke out in 1939, Jersey seemed far away from the action. But by 1940, the Channel Islands would actually become really crucial to the war. In fact, the islands were the only piece of British soil that the Nazis conquered. And they were crucial to what Hitler called his Atlantic Wall. The Atlantic Wall refers to this line of defense in the West designed to keep the Allies at bay. And thousands of German troops soon arrived on the island to build fortifications that would be used to protect the continent from Allied assault. And it was so important that Hitler personally received regular updates from the island. So no dissent could be tolerated in this location. And yet that's exactly what Lucy and Suzanne did. Back in Paris, they had been involved in left-wing politics, befriending communists and other radicals. They had signed petitions and open letters against the rise of fascism and protesting anti-immigrant legislation. Lucy had written a letter to a magazine supporting gay rights. So by the time they arrived on Jersey, they had been rebels for some time. Add to that, their own lives as a lesbian couple lived in opposition to the mores of their day, their provocative artwork, and that challenged notions of beauty and gender identity. Ultimately, all of these strands of their lives came together to not only give them the strength to resist the German occupation of Jersey, but to really give them the skills to do so. They put their creative talents and their political inclinations and their personal backgrounds into their work, and it gave them the tools to fight back. Resistance was not an afterthought, but the peak and the point of their creative lives. And more importantly, I think their love kept them going as they supported one another through what were some very scary and very stressful moments over the 4 years that they engaged in this resistance activity. I really don't believe that either of them alone could have done it. I think just like their art, which was all collaborative and they worked on together, all of this resistance came out of their relationship. So as I said before, their desire to resist led them to write these notes to the Nazis, something that on the face of it seems small and even inconsequential, but the notes were powerful. All of the messages were designed to demoralize the troops or to convince them to desert or to mutiny or to go back to their families in Germany. And the German army took them very seriously. For 4 years, the secret field police, which was tasked with keeping order in all these occupied territories, tracked them down to trying to find out who was leaving these notes all around the island. Sometimes the agents would find them on a fence post. Sometimes they would find them on a cafe table. Sometimes they would find the notes tucked into a magazine at the newsstand. And sometimes they would find them placed inside their own staff cars and occasionally even in their own pockets because Lucy and Suzanne had slipped them into the pockets. One of my favorite things that they did is not so much a note, but it's actually a banner that they hung over the altar in a church near their house where some of the soldiers worshiped. And the banner read, "Jesus is great, but Hitler is greater because Jesus died for people, but people died for Hitler." So what they were doing with notes like this, and in this case of this banner is kind of a sarcastic comment, they were really scaring the German command into believing that a conspiracy was afoot on the island, this island that was so strategically important that Hitler was receiving regular updates about the construction of the Atlantic Wall. So was there someone on Jersey who was undermining what they were doing? Was there someone who was engaged in a conspiracy? These notes really only provoked the German fear and the German paranoia. Sorry, I thought you were about to say something.
No, I'm good. Yeah.
Okay.
Except I would say, imagine with certain politicians putting notes like this into their pockets today, particularly somebody who lives about 30 miles up A1A from me here.
Right.
It would be a wonderful thing if this kind of stuff were still happening today.
Right. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit more and say a little bit more about the notes themselves, because it, like you said, it's, and when I've given this talk before and talked to other groups, a lot of people, I think, sort of say to themselves exactly the same thing that you were just saying. It's like, is there something I could do here? Maybe I could use this technique to do some kind of resistance. So maybe we could look more specifically at some of the notes. And I think this also goes into the question of how they go about doing it, because I think the notes that really frightened the Germans the most were the ones that Lucy and Suzanne signed, but they didn't sign them with their own name. They signed them with this invented name. They created a fictional persona and pretended to write messages from that perspective, but they wrote them in German. since Suzanne was fluent in German. And the persona that they chose was significant. They called him the soldier with no name. So in other words, they were once again crossing gender lines. They were essentially becoming a German soldier when they took on this persona. They wrote in this male German voice, aimed at the other soldiers. And in doing so, they made the secret police believe that the threat was coming from within the German army itself. I think this was one of their innovations, really. Note writing, as we were saying before, was not unique to them. There are other cases of people doing this in German occupied territory, and even within Nazi Germany itself, writing anti-Nazi notes. But I think these notes were really aimed at the civilian population. Or excuse me, most notes like that were aimed at the civilian population. But as far as I can tell, Lucy and Suzanne were the only, or one of a very few number of people who were actually writing notes not to the other civilians, but aimed at the soldiers themselves. That's why I think the only real parallel to this is the Allied PSYOPS campaign, as they were dropping German language leaflets behind enemy lines. But this was something that they did in a kind of homegrown effort, as I was saying. So essentially, they were trying to get inside the minds of the soldiers to sow seeds of doubt and dissension, hoping that these messages would go viral, so to speak. They would even write at the bottom of these notes, please distribute, please pass on, hoping that people would share the notes.
And so, Jeff, what we're looking at now with these actual notes, do the actual papers still exist today? And did you actually see them in your research?
So the notes that exist today, the copies, and there's really only a handful, because they, as I talk about in the book, when they're put on trial by the German court-martial, the Germans have about 300 or 350 examples of their notes. But that is only a small fraction of what they produce. They actually have this discussion with the officers in the court-martial. Well, how many notes did you make? And basically both of them say, well, we don't know. We weren't really counting. But they essentially say we were making hundreds and hundreds of these notes. But of those notes, only this very small handful survive. I think it's about 15 or so. Now, these notes that are there in the archive on Jersey, and there are copies of some of these at the archives at Yale University, which I also looked at, are really reproductions. So I don't think any of them are the actual original notes. These are things that after the war, that Suzanne in particular wrote down what she remembered of their notes. And a lot of those notes were copied over and over again. So they might type, 20, 30 copies of the same message on their typewriter and to distribute them around. So so a lot of them were duplicates, but the ones that are in existence today are sort of post-war reconstructions of it. But I think they're, it's because they did it so much and so often. I feel confident that they remembered basically the content of the notes that they had written during the war. Let me again sort of skip ahead to say a little bit more, because the other thing that that happens is that they end up getting put into prison. Not sure where I want to skip to. Let's go here. They end up getting put into prison, arrested, as I said, put on trial, and put into prison, where they spend about 8 months behind bars for this work. They're essentially ratted out by one of the other islanders and caught and arrested and sentenced to death. They have a death sentence that hangs over their head the entire time that they're in prison, and they don't know what's going to happen. They really believe that they will be killed at any moment. And so they're not physically harmed or tortured in the prison, but there is an intense sort of psychological torment that they go through. And this image that you're seeing on the screen is a cigarette packet, a drawing that was done during that time in prison. They did a lot of things like this just to sort of keep themselves occupied, keep their minds active. And I don't know this for certain, but I wonder whether the image there, the large image of the German soldier, might be their main jailer, whose name was Otto, who they actually got to know. And that's one of the remarkable things about the story, is that the guards in the prison were relatively kind to them. And yet again, like I say, they didn't know, at what moment would the soldiers take them out and execute them. But even during their time in prison, Lucy and Suzanne kept up their efforts at defying the Nazis. Not only did they befriend the guards, they continued to pass notes, and they also talked to other prisoners and offered them comfort. And so the book, I think, is full of these kind of surprising episodes of what took place, for example, in prison. German guards who were both frightening and humane, the prisoners keeping each other's spirits up with singing, Lucy and Suzanne smuggling notes to one another in prison, tales of German deserters being hauled off and executed, leaving Lucy and Suzanne to wonder if they were next. But there's one story in particular that stands out because I think it highlights their relationship, really the love story, and why that's so important to this. So as Lucy's being interrogated by one of the German interrogators, she makes this, what is at the time, and she even says later as she's recounting this in a memoir, that it's a really kind of stunning admission. She blurts out, "I am on my father's side of Jewish origin." So basically, she admitted to being an unregistered Jew living in Nazi-occupied territory, thereby putting herself in grave danger. Then she confessed to the supposed crime, telling her interrogator that she wrote all the notes by herself and that the whole thing had been her idea. And she was trying to convince her interrogators that she alone had the motive to become the soldier with no name. But in reality, she was not claiming credit for their work as the true mastermind behind the campaign, as some scholars have believed when they've looked at these documents. In fact, Lucy knew just how much of their resistance Suzanne was responsible for. And she even wrote, "It was more often me who accompanied Suzanne, she who took the initiative, that required the most sang-froid." Instead, what Lucy was doing with this calculated risk in admitting her Jewishness was that she was trying to take the fall to save Suzanne's life. If the police believed that Lucy alone had a motive to write their notes, then the woman she loved might somehow get off. We have time for a quick. I could read an excerpt from the book if we have a few minutes.
Yes, of course, of course.
Let me read an excerpt, sort of toward the end of the book, where I'm just trying to think about this question of what it had all meant. Lucy and Suzanne had survived the war, but they had to work hard to make sense of what it had meant. After all, they didn't drive the Germans from Jersey with their notes, but in some very important, very personal ways, their effort was a success. And I think their success is something that speaks to us today about the power of creativity and imagination and persistence, especially in trying times. So I think they've left us with a story about how even small acts of protest and refusal can have significant effects that are sometimes hard to see until later. They remind us, I think, also why history matters. That because in the midst of our present day difficulties like a pandemic or deep political polarization or economic uncertainty, we could look back to these stories of people who had it far worse, but who somehow survived. So I want to end with this excerpt where I'm just kind of thinking about the question of how they made sense of all this and what it all kind of meant to them. So after the war, one day in Saint-Hélier, which is the capital of Jersey, Lucy and Suzanne encountered a woman whom they had never met before. She stopped them and proclaimed, "I'm so happy to see you alive." Several others also gathered around to greet Lucy and Suzanne. They were in disbelief to learn that the women had survived the ordeal. It must have been a dreadful experience, the woman continued. Now you must forget all about it. Lucy and Suzanne were left dumbfounded by her blithe advice. Later, Lucy sat on her bed, leafing through a stack of papers. Next to her on a small table where she placed her tea tray sat the square hat box one of the German guards had given to her last August as a place to keep her personal items. Other than her memories, the miscellaneous mementos inside this box were all that she had left of their months behind bars. Of all our baggage, she said, the hat box was the only one that had any value. She determined that she would organize all the prison communications, letters, drawings, and notes between her and Suzanne. Few of the documents from their earlier lives had survived the occupation of their home by the Germans. She speculated that the soldiers had used them to light fires in the fireplace. Lucy gave some papers to a friend on Jersey, and she sent a few other items to friends back in Paris, but the ones with the most personal meaning did not leave that box. The memories were too precious. When Lucy couldn't sleep, she reread the notes that Suzanne had written to her during their prison stay, some of them on sanitary napkins, and felt strangely nostalgic. But as the days went on, her thoughts began to darken. Lucy had always been the more pessimistic of the two, prone to depression and suicidal feelings, and her gloomier meditations in the aftermath of the war echoed that part of her personality. She later wrote about how she had become possessed in those days by an overwhelming fear that all her struggles had been for nothing, that there were no greater lessons to learn from all the experiences she had lived through: Suzanne's suicide attempt, their home plundered, illness, death. In the months after the war, they had even had to put their beloved cat to sleep. Lucy likened herself in her reminiscences to a repeat offender Lazarus, rising from the dead over and over, only to witness still more suffering. And throughout the years that followed, she wrote about the war in lengthy letters to friends and in early drafts of what might have become a memoir had she lived longer. Now, these writings were not the sort of personal quest for personal identity that she had posed as a young woman in the 1920s and 1930s, but rather they were an attempt to make sense of what the war and their time in prison had meant in broader, more universal terms, despite her underlying fear that there was no such meaning to be made. But there had been a point to what they did. Lucy wrote in a 1950 letter, she wrote, quote, "From July 1940, the invasion of Jersey, until May 1945, the liberation of the Channel Islands, yes, even in prison, even in secret, I wrote to encourage men, including the German soldiers, to liberate themselves." Now, whether such liberation, self-liberation took place was easy to doubt, yet there were occasional glimpses of something that might offer a larger perspective and a sense perhaps of vindication. In January 1946, for example, Suzanne received a letter in German from a POW military hospital. It was from Heinrich Ebers, one of the men who had guarded Lucy and Suzanne in prison. Surely German jailers did not typically write to their former inmates. His family was alive and in good health, he reported, and the British were treating him well. He asked Suzanne to greet Lucy and then to write him back. In some strange way, perhaps Heinrich the guard had liberated himself and wanted them to know it. Lucy and Suzanne had liberated themselves through their resistance work too. Lucy in particular had struggled with the question of identity her whole life, from her youth in an assimilated Jewish household during the heat of the Dreyfus affair, to her struggles with her mother's mental illness and her own poor health. Her early writings as Claude Cahun were inwardly focused and tortured, an extended attempt to answer the question, who am I, which neither her book nor her evolving self-presentation or her numerous aliases and her radical politics could ever seem to resolve. She was always looking for more. But Lucy finally found her identity through The Soldier with No Name, and so did Suzanne. The war was the one moment in their lives when they seemed to have the strongest sense of purpose and the most direct vision about who they wanted to be. Against the Nazis, there was a moral clarity and a certainty, which their earlier work did not always have. The Soldier with No Name finally liberated them to speak as loudly and as distinctly as they wanted. That's the end of my presentation, and we can talk for a few more minutes. But I think give the overarching part of the story. And I'll just say a quick shout out, by the way, for folks, if you're interested in purchasing a signed copy of this book, I've partnered with my local bookstore here in Memphis, Novel Books, and you can order a signed copy from them. And I've done a number of times to go out there and sign books, and they'll ship them to folks. And I always love to partner with local bookstores. And I know there's great local bookstores in your area in South Florida, but if anybody wants a signature, I'm happy to do that as well with the folks in Memphis. So,
well, Jeff, we would love to have a signed copy of yours in our archive. We certainly have one here, but we have over 1,000 rare books at the Stonewall Library, and so we would love to be able to get a signed copy of yours here as well. Too.
Happy to do that.
And also, I'm with you 100%. For those of you who can purchase books from local independent booksellers, that is really, an amazing thing to be able to do. We buy a lot of our books from an LGBTQ library in New York. But I guess as we finish, you really sort of touch something, and the book touches it as well too, which is about these two women's later lives. And so Claude, Lucy, passed away in 1954. So that was 9 years after the end of World War II. And so when did Suzanne die?
She died in 1972, I believe it was.
Okay. So you've touched on it a little bit, but did they ever get to lead for those 9 years after the war? did you get a sense of what their life was like as a couple? At that time, there was a little bit more gay liberation that was going on in the 50s, certainly not something that we've seen today. But for those 9 years, can you describe a little bit about what their relationship was like?
That's a great question. And it's hard to know because they don't talk about it as much. What they really do, in those years when they are kind of writing down their reminiscences, what they're really writing down is the time that they spent in the war. They're really trying to process that. So I think some of it is just trying to make sense of everything that they've gone through. Jersey was, and I think in many ways still is, a kind of a conservative place. So I think they kept to themselves a lot. Lucy was a very quiet, shy, introverted person. Suzanne was the much more outgoing of the two, but I always got the sense in all the research that I did that Lucy was really sort of, she wanted to kind of keep to herself, and Suzanne was willing to go along with that. So I think after the war, they certainly had some friends and had some connections, but I think largely they kind of kept to themselves, tried to rebuild. One thing they had to do, and I talk about this in the book, was to go out and find their furniture that the Germans had stolen from their house and taken to other, to their headquarters or to other places on the island. So they really had to try to, as much as they could to find their stuff, rebuild. They certainly did travel back to Paris from time to time to visit friends, but Lucy also, her health really deteriorated after the war. The time in prison was very stressful for her physically. She talks about the dust coming through the air ducts in the prison, and it really sort of aggravated her lungs. And so she really kind of, there's a sense, she sort of hints at this. She doesn't go into great detail, but she hints at the fact that after the war, her health is just, really not very good. So I think it was kind of a mixture of sort of processing the war, continuing to sort of, live the artistic lives that they wanted to live, but then also dealing with health issues and just trying to kind of, make it to the next day in a sense.
I mean, of course, Lucy only lived to be 60 years old, roughly. We have a question here about Lucy's relatives and what their fate was, which also leads me to the question, too. Do you know that either one of the women had children? Because in many cases, lesbians could have been married to another man or have had sex with a man in which they could have become pregnant and had children.
They never had any children. This actually comes up in the interrogation as the Germans are asking them various things. But Suzanne very explicitly says we have no children. The question that he's asking has to do with money and how much money they're spending, and she basically says we're going to spend all our money because we don't have any children to pass it on to. When they left Jersey, or excuse me, when they left France to move to Jersey, I really get the sense that they mostly had kind of cut off relations with their families, not necessarily because of animosity or anything like that, but I think a lot of their family had passed away, for one thing. In fact, that's part of what allows them to move, is that Suzanne's mother passes away and she inherits a lot of money, and that gives them more resources to be able to move and to buy this very large house, actually right on the beach on Jersey. Suzanne's brother had passed away many years earlier. So I think a lot of them are either gone or they're back in Nantes and they just sort of don't. I didn't find family correspondence, for example. I didn't find, anything except for maybe one or two letters that didn't really shed much light on anything. So that relationship is very hard to understand, but my sense is that their family was not part of their lives. So I don't know a whole lot about, the family that did remain there, cousins or whatever, because it just doesn't show up in their records.
And of course, Suzanne survived Lucy, and as you say, they both came from wealthy families. And it's so interesting, in case people miss this, to again remember that each of their parents married each other, and they ended up being stepsisters, even though their relationship had actually started a bit before. But so, any idea what happened to the wealth after Suzanne passed away? I think she passed away like what, 72, 74?
Yeah, I think it was 72, right in there. That's a good question. I don't know what happens to the money in the bank. They make a point of saying that they're going to leave their money in France. When they leave to go to Jersey, they say, "Oh, but don't worry, we're leaving our money in France." So it perhaps did go to French relatives. I know that what remains of their household gets auctioned off, and that's sort of the story. And I tell this a little bit at the end of the book in the section about the sources that I use, that a lot of their papers get auctioned off and their artwork gets auctioned off. And it just sort of goes for a pittance, really, because nobody knows who they are. And so this one collector kind of buys up, you know, the lot of their work and papers and stuff. And he's just sort of a collector who's interested in surrealism and kind of avant-garde work and buys it for almost nothing. The house, you know, also gets sold off, but the money in the bank, that's a good question. I don't know, and I'm not even sure how I'd find that out. But yeah, it seems like there's really, you know, they don't really have those kind of connections still.
Yeah, it's a, you know, it's a very interesting point because, of course, you tell this amazing 20th century journey with a lesbian couple and World War II and direct involvement with the Nazis. The idea about the Jersey Islands being sort of part of that Atlantic front for the Nazis is really astonishing, and how they were such resistors to the whole thing. And at least that Suzanne, not that she necessarily would have known it, but she lived past Stonewall. She lived past 1969, in which there were beginnings, certainly in America, but certainly in France and Great Britain. There, you know, the Cultural Revolution of the 1960s had certainly happened, and the feminist revolution had certainly happened. So at least Suzanne had the opportunity, should she availed herself of it, to be able to see some of those things.
Right.
They didn't last long. But Jeff, I can't tell you how much I appreciate your time and this amazing story. And again, the name of the book is Paper Bullets. And so if you have friends who have not been able to join us, please have them come to stonewall-museum.org and they can see this entire talk. Thank you so much for your research and your time to make this available. I have one last question for you. Do you have a new project that you're working on?
Well, let me first end by saying thank you so much for the invitation. It's been a real honor to speak to you tonight and to share the story. I do have a new project that I'm working on. I don't like to say too much about it because, you know, not good. I may it may all fall apart. It's a very different story. It's a Cold War story, but it kind of, you know, the connection to me for me is that I like to find these stories that, like I said earlier, are really stories that happen at ground level with the lived experience of sort of ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances. And maybe Lucy and Suzanne were completely ordinary in some ways, but in other ways they were ordinary and find themselves, you know, thrust into the middle of this. And that's kind of what this new book that I'm working on is also about. It's an episode that happens at the Berlin Wall that kind of raises a whole series of questions, kind of like Paper Bullets does, about, you know, the nature of the human experience, about conflict and war, and sort of our ethical responsibility, you know, in those kind of circumstances.
And a final thank you in the sense that those of us who have been trying to share LGBTQ history, we're so appreciative of allies who want to be able to share these stories and understand that these are very important human stories to share and are not frightened off by the topic. And so, Jeff, thank you for the time that you put into this particular effort. So,
well, thank you so much. That means a lot to me. I appreciate that.
Yes. And so to my colleague, Paula Sierra, Paula, reveal yourself here one last time. Thank you there. You're there. Thank you. Thank you for that big. So for all of you for joining us. This is great. We're 3 minutes over, so we have to stop, but feel free to join us anytime at stonewall-museum.org. Thank you, everyone. Good night.
Good night.